Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Don Webster with Business and Decision North America. We're going to do some information here on app development in SharePoint 2013. Not a big slides guy. I don't have a ton, but I do have a lot to say about the slides, so we'll go through these in pretty good detail here. There's quite a bit to cover in the half hour we've got. So let's go ahead and get started. First slide, I always kind of like to take a look back at application evolution of SharePoint whenever we're talking about these types of things, because it helps a little bit to know where we've came from. So I'm a little loath to mention 2003 because it was just such a bad entry into the platform, but we'll put it up here anyway because you could write web parts against that release. I'm not going to read through all these things, but basically the whole premise behind this is Microsoft has evolved how they present customizing SharePoint solutions over the last 6 years, actually 10 years if you count 2003. And things have certainly gotten a lot better for developers and end users alike as the tools have improved and technology has improved. But things really kicked off in 2007 when you could actually write some solid full trust code to go against the farm, but that brought a lot of issues to light with breaking the farm and a lot of other reasons. And 2010, they took a stab at sandboxing things and making everything into a little bit more friendly applications for the farm, but they limited things to such a degree that it really didn't work out all that well. So in 2013, they took a step back and deprecated the sandbox stuff and have provided us with some very, very good tools on how to turn SharePoint into a loosely coupled application development platform and reach heights that it could not have done before these tools were introduced. So we'll jump over to the next slide, and this is evolution of those customizations. So this is like I basically just said, the full trust in 2007, jumped into the sandbox in 2010, and then moving to the app model we have today in 2013, and that's definitely going to stay in 2015 as well. And there'll probably be enhancements in there, of course. So, back with the full trust solutions, you're really, with those, you've missed the control because you have to grant, and more from a security perspective, you have to grant full access rights to the code across the applications and servers. And, in the previous versions of full trust, you did have limited access, but it was difficult to do, and it wasn't used that often because of the difficulty. In general, deployment usually causes services to break on the servers, and there was really no way to update a server without at least recycling the app pool. So it required a lot of downtime from an IT perspective, and a lot of heartache from a lot of people over the years for using 2007. And those challenges continue today to people that are still using 2007 as their primary platform for SharePoint. Jump into the sandbox. The customization story is enhanced from an administrative perspective, and we gained some control over the farm and how we deployed applications. And obviously, this was introduced in 2010. It was way too strict from a server-side API level, which developers have been used to, and the client-side APIs were far too limited that you really couldn't implement much of anything. It had some basic functionality on the client-side object model, the CSOM, but it was not well received, and people still kind of stuck to the full trust model because what they gave us for tools just didn't work out very good. And now on to 2013, the app model has truly evolved into allowing us to achieve those key objectives on our code and our solutions, and those being control, trust, and management of those pieces. So Microsoft's put a ton of work into the platform to enable us to really get where we want to go from a development standpoint on managing our code and getting things running. So let's jump into real quick configuring the farm for your apps. If you're in Office 365, this really isn't a necessary step. This is really an on-premise thing. It's pretty simple. It all runs from the central admin. You can do it through PowerShell if you want. This is the GUI way. I'm not going to read through these slides. This will all be available later from the B&D website for steps, and there's probably 300,000 blog posts on how to do this anyway. It's pretty simple. There's about 5 or 6 steps. You jump into the catalog, and you'll see it available, and then you just need, after this piece is over, you need to configure the farm for apps with a custom separate domain that the apps run in. So we'll get to the significance of this piece here in a minute. So you'll obviously need somebody in the organization with some access to your DNS servers to make these changes for you, and you'll probably need some discussion around how you're going to make that domain pop up and different things and what the name's going to be. There's also a nice little PowerShell script here for you to run, which is freely available on the web. I did not write this myself. It was already out there and available by the time we needed it. When you run this PowerShell script, it basically creates a new service application in a new pool for your new custom domain for the apps. So it's pretty straightforward, and again, this is available all over the place, so you can grab it and run it and fire it up, and things will work right out of the box. The last step to configuring, excuse me, I clicked one too many times, to configuring the app, the URLs there, is head back to Central Admin after that PowerShell script is run and everything's in place with your new app pool. And you type in the app domain, the app prefix, and click OK, and you're pretty much done. And then you'll have the ability to deploy apps and get your custom app catalog up in SharePoint on-prem. And that's pretty straightforward. Not a whole lot to that guy, so which is why we're skipping over it pretty quick. So let's take a look at something a little more interesting. The app model itself is, as we mentioned, very robust. So we've got three basic questions, two questions here, and then kind of a statement. So apps versus solutions, why apps, and then app isolation, and what's that really mean? So apps versus solution, an app for SharePoint is a standalone, self-contained piece of functionality that extends the capabilities and features of a SharePoint site. Apps can bring together best of both worlds, modern web technologies and all the pieces that you're familiar with in SharePoint. And on top of that, users can easily discover and download those apps from the public store, if that's enabled, and their organization's private app catalog. So in contrast, a solution is used to customize or enhance SharePoint sites and needs a farm administrator to deploy, manage, and remove. Obviously, there's scripts in place to handle this stuff. It's a lot easier in 2013 than it was in 2007. There's a lot less work to get those things out there into the farm. But the same caveats and negatives still remain about deploying those solutions. Sometimes you need to bounce the app pool. Sometimes a full IIS resets in order, just depending on the situation. So next question is, why apps? Well, so the first question I asked when they came out with this is, why would I use an app? So this is probably going to vary depending on who you ask, but for me, it's being able to leverage all the flexibility that a typical .NET developer has, and that's a big deal. In my opinion, this is really a paradigm shift and a very smart move by Microsoft, and I think it's going to go a long way in attracting more developers to the platform. And internal statistics that they've shared with us from the Microsoft side, and they've done this through different venues to the public as well, is there's about 700 or so thousand SharePoint developers in the world, and the number of just generic .NET guys are in the millions, right? So we're definitely more of a unique and niche breed than your typical .NET developer. Not that they wouldn't come over to the platform, but the changes that they've made are certainly going to be a very attractive thing with regular .NET developers, just because the handcuffs are really starting to come off when it comes to developing SharePoint solutions. So apps are actually isolated, and by that I mean they cannot talk to another app. So by default, apps are deployed to that own website and an isolated domain, like we talked about in the previous slide with the DNS piece, rather than to a farm or a sandbox. So all processes for apps run in that separate domain. The foundation for understanding this new development model is really to grasp the concept of how server-side code is handled. This new model says that no server-side code can be deployed to the SharePoint servers. SharePoint handles what it does well: lists, libraries, workflows, content, etc. But if you extend or need to extend that out-of-the-box functionality of SharePoint with custom logic, then all that code has to run somewhere else. So that's the basic premise behind the apps and the isolation. Is the great thing, you can't break the farm anymore. The only thing that's going to blow up is your app. it simplifies development, it simplifies updates, it simplifies testing. There's a whole lot of benefits to with this loosely coupled model that they've actually defined. All right, and moving on, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. So there's quite a bit to cover here on the different ways to host these applications. So we'll start with SharePoint hosted here. And these types of apps are manifested within SharePoint generally without external dependencies. And primarily we're talking about HTML, JavaScript, and maybe some Silverlight stuff on the front end for the actual language. Any custom business logic that's implemented with custom code has to run within the context of the browser or the client. One explicit limitation of the SharePoint app model is that server-side code is explicitly prohibited from residing in the SharePoint form, as I mentioned earlier, as part of an app. Any server-side code that is utilized in the context of the app must be hosted outside of SharePoint, either in the cloud or an on-premise server. It doesn't really matter where, but you have to be able to access and leverage that too. And when you have that server-side code running elsewhere, it can still access and leverage SharePoint lists and libraries and all the functionalities that they've extended to us through the tool set. If you plan to use a SharePoint hosted deployment model, you're limited to static files. However, you can include JavaScript and Silverlight there, as I mentioned a minute ago, and those will run dynamic code on the client side, and they can call the CSOM, the client-side object model, and interact with that to do the SharePoint work that you need to get done. So, as with this SharePoint hosted model, you're likely to employ the JavaScript API, of course, and if you're just coding a static HTML page or the Silverlight runtime. You can technically use the REST API from JavaScript and Silverlight if you wish to do so, but the other APIs are generally a better fit. On the provider-hosted piece, these types of apps, they probably have a SharePoint component, but the bulk of the business logic is usually living in some other infrastructure, such as an external web server or, say, in the Azure cloud. These types of apps are a good option with integrating an existing something like an event registration or a help desk within the SharePoint site. When a user accesses these apps, they are redirected to a page on the external server where the application resides. So SharePoint's really consuming this application from an external source, right? Sort of like an iframe would do for your typical HTML page. In the model, you can run server-side code, but it has to be on that external server. There's no way to run custom code in the SharePoint server, as I mentioned earlier. One of the benefits is that the external server doesn't need to be Windows. SharePoint's really just redirecting the user to a web page, and so we can use any operating system and any application we want as long as it can fulfill web requests. So if you're a PHP guy and you want to have a Linux machine or you've got an existing PHP application you can add some functionality to interact with SharePoint, you can still make a SharePoint app because all the application logic and all the execution is happening elsewhere. Another really good reason to use the model is that it really puts you in control of the upgrades. Since that's a separate server that you own, you can deploy updates and have them applied immediately for all of the customers or all of your users in the organization. In other models, the user has to take some type of action to upgrade because you don't have access to the server in which the app is hosted. So this would be an example of really breaking the paradigm of the SharePoint has to live in the SharePoint server. That's really where this provider-hosted piece comes from. And we'll jump into auto-hosted as the last piece here. We've got similar to the provider-hosted apps, and they've got the bulk of the business logic and or data is manifested externally. So the difference with auto-hosted apps is they live in Azure as an app package, and it contains the website and the database in the package. When the app's installed in a site, SharePoint automatically handles the provisioning of the database as, say, a SQL Azure database, and the website, say an Azure-hosted website, using an account that has been set up by you or a SharePoint farm administrator or the tenant administrator for Office 365. So if you make a SharePoint hosted app, you can't obviously run that server-side code, right? But you don't have to pay for a server on which to host your app. So depending on your approach, if you're an independent developer, going the auto-hosted route is going to cost you money because you're going to live in the Azure cloud. They're going to bill you by the minute, right, for all the time that those apps are running. If you're part of an organization, this really isn't something you really need to worry about as much. They've probably got something in Azure from an account basis to facilitate that, or it's pretty easy to set up. So if you pause. Sorry, jumped away from my notes there. Automatically provisioned apps are really the best of both worlds. It's an app that's designed to be deployed to Azure, and this means that it's hosted outside the SharePoint and can run the custom code. Whenever a SharePoint Online user adds the app to their SharePoint instance, SharePoint tells them that the app needs to be provisioned to Azure, and if they opt to let that happen, then the Azure instance will be built to their SharePoint Online account. So, as you know, there's a public store that's available for SharePoint and Office 365. So this would be where that would come into play. So the great thing about the auto-hosted piece is you get all the flexibility and capabilities of server-side code without the cost of actually hosting it yourself when you do that app model if they're actually consuming it from the public store, which is a pretty cool thing as like an independent developer. From an organizational standpoint, if you're just a normal SharePoint developer on a staff of 10, you don't worry about these types of things. But it's still nice to know, nonetheless, that you don't have to actually work and run that infrastructure yourself if you're going to be a commercial SharePoint app developer. And that market's probably got some legs, most likely, if you can come up with some pretty compelling solutions for the marketplace. Let's see. The client-side object model is one of the areas in which Microsoft has poured a ton of work. As I mentioned earlier, SharePoint 2010 had a really limited set of functionality, but there's almost nothing you can't do on the CSOM of 2013. Obviously, you've got to have a fully functional client-side API when you're trying to encourage people to move away from server-side code. So they actually enabled all those pieces to actually work. So now you can consume that CSOM through whatever web request you want and then make it happen. So it's a lot of flexibility and a lot of power in your hands today. And there's three ways you can access CSOM. Basically, .NET Silverlight API, JavaScript API, or the REST API. Deployment model that you're going to use will, determine the option that you choose from those three pieces. So now, maybe you're wondering, JavaScript, right? API. What's there to keep every idiot who can code against the JavaScript API from bombarding your SharePoint instance with malicious requests to hammer all of your data or try to crack into your application? Well, thankfully, Microsoft placed a pretty extensive layer of security around the SharePoint 2013 app model. The 2013 app requests a specific set of permissions when they are installed. If the current user has the ability to grant the app these permissions, then the application can be installed. If they cannot grant that level of access, then the application cannot be installed. So it's really quite simple on that level. So the SharePoint hosted apps, obviously, the JavaScript, the static file piece has the benefit of using the built-in security because they operate in the same domain and context where the files are hosted. And the self-hosted and Azure provisioned apps are going to use OAuth for security purposes. So you don't have to worry too much about this. Microsoft put a lot of thought and security around the app model and around Azure itself, so you're pretty well covered. I haven't heard of anybody breaking into Azure yet, and it's probably not likely to happen. You might have some questions about that one. Feel free to drop them in there. That was a pretty extensive topic. So we'll jump over to the next slide. And this is a quick overview, just kind of a high-level look at the app development model. So this view really allows us to take a look at architecture decisions and how we might approach building a specific solution within the context of SharePoint. Obviously, we talked about earlier about loosely coupled architecture, right, for building apps in 2013. This architecture gives you the freedom of choice in technologies that you use to not only host the applications, but the tools that you want to use to write them. Apps can leverage industry standard web stuff, HTML, JavaScript, jQuery, JSON, REST, OAuth, etc., to provide a really great user experience at the end of the day. So one thing to note, though, with the app development model, even though they've given us all these tools to do all this cool stuff from different technologies like PHP or whatever, right, on the web, the need to interact with SharePoint on some level still exists. Otherwise, why would you write something that's going to live in SharePoint? You're going to interact with SharePoint in some way. So they don't completely abstract away needing to learn some SharePoint functionality. You don't have to become a SharePoint expert to do SharePoint stuff with the new client object model, but you still have to understand the context that you're running things in and be able to make those decisions on an architecture level for SharePoint. So a gentleman by the name of, jump over to the next slide, of Adrian Feichter, I believe it's Feichter, maybe Fichter, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, put together a really cool chart on how to help with architecture direction for SharePoint. This is a pretty good guideline overall. So you can look through this slide and it gives you some feedback on just like a decision tree matrix, right? Like, okay, these are the things I need to do, yes, no, and this is where my app can really live. So the blue are your decision pieces here, the orange is I can't do that in the cloud, right? This is an on-premise only thing because it's a farm solution, it's a full trust solution. That's still possible in 2013, it's just not what Microsoft is pushing with the new app model. Yellow is can't be used with 365 multi-tenant, but it might work with dedicated. Just depends on the situation. And obviously green's cloud ready. So with O365, the big thing to know is that it's almost 100% bit-for-bit copy of SharePoint on-prem. So there's a few things you can't do. You can't invoke delegates in 365 unless they do some updates and different things like that. But for the most part, from a code perspective, if you can do it in prem, you can do it in 365, which is really pretty awesome because if your company starts out with on-prem and you guys move to 365, all your stuff should still work, which is always a wonderful thing. You don't have to back and retool or refactor any of the application stuff to make things go. One thing to know, the SharePoint app model stands version 1.0 today. So 3 years ago, SharePoint 2010 sandbox solutions were also version 1.0. And today, they're deprecated 3 short years later. The point, well, you can't really ever be sure how technology is going to stick or how long it's going to stick around. With this in mind, it's important to evaluate if an app is the right thing for you. It's not that you shouldn't use an app, but just to make sure you're making your decisions carefully. The fact that they've already, have a lot of data out there on 2015 that's coming next year, believe it or not, probably about a year from now. Most likely in April, then the app model is still a big part of that. It's probably not going away. It's just something I wanted to point out that 3 years ago, everyone thought that sandbox solutions were the great big thing, and now they're pretty much dead. So yeah, you know how that is. That's just the way technology goes, right? You never know how it's going to work out. So for my final slide for questions, I got about 7 minutes left here. I'd like to give you a few helpful tips on things I've uncovered and picked up over the web over the last several months doing SharePoint work. So SP Fast Deploy is a pretty cool tool that saved a lot of time, giving me the ability to make code changes and see the changes quickly. It'll actually auto-deploy your code changes out to the Office 365 cloud as you save your solution, which is pretty slick. You don't have to do, and they made it really easy in 2013, in Visual Studio 2013, to actually push those code changes, but that tool is actually pretty slick just because you don't have to worry about it. When you save it, it just updates on the cloud, and then you can go check it out and see how it's working. Some good code samples. There's a link here. This is on CodePlex. You can do a search there for SharePoint 2013. This will be one of the first things that pops up, but there's a lot of good information on, and data and sample projects on CodePlex to get you started with some SharePoint dev. One thing that I've done for a long time, and it's really true with SharePoint, is use a VM to do your dev. You can isolate all that and have one nice self-contained development environment that you can carry with you in a removable drive, or if your laptop has 2 hard drives, that's even better. You know, VMs obviously run better not on your host drive, and SSDs have come down significantly in cost, and those make a big difference running a VM, so that's always a good way to go too. I really like actually doing dev in the Azure cloud just as a VM instance up there, because I can turn it on when I want to do work and I can shut it down when I don't and not get billed for it. So it's pretty handy and flexible. Another thing that's really good for doing VM dev is you can create teams. You've been able to do this in VMware for a long time, but in Server 2012 on the VM side, on the Hyper-V side, you can finally create teaming between VMs. So you can actually replicate a full production farm if you've got the horsepower on the machine you're running, or you can do it up in the cloud. So you can really, get a true end-to-end test and dev setup that actually compares and mirrors your production sites. So you can make sure that everything is going going along well with that, so you don't have to go, well, it ran on my dev server, right? You guys know how that goes. It's if you can replicate that environment, it's always a big boon. So always test your code using accounts that have the same permissions that your end users will have in production. This is a big deal because it's a lot easier to let everything run as admin, and it always works when it runs as admin. So you want to make sure you're replicating the permission levels. Obviously, the account names don't have to be the same, but that you're running your apps and doing your testing through. That way, you know when you push to production, things will work because you've done a good job of setting up your development and QA environments to mirror your production environment. Always use the SharePoint ULS logs to write out warnings and errors. This is really easy to do, and you can even use it for debugging if you want to. If you don't, the only other option is to try to write your own error logging system, which is going to be cumbersome and time consuming. And you may not have access to actually write to the app event logs within the operating system. That is not typically something we get to do, depending on how strict IT is. But as a SharePoint developer, you've definitely got the ULS logs, and there's a couple really nice ULS log readers on CodePlex. So you don't have to actually thumb, because they're pretty extensive and pretty nasty to read in Notepad, trust me. So these readers are great, and those readers will actually feed it out to you real time as well. I probably should have put a link in here to those, but they're pretty easy to find with a search on CodePlex. So you can have your ULS log reader in one window on your system, and you're deving another, you're running things, you're doing a test, and you can actually see the output coming through the ULS logs to know if you've got errors or things are actually succeeding. So it's a very good tool for debugging purposes. Make good use of developer dashboard in Dev and QA. This is kind of a little known feature. There's actually a diagnostic setting that can be turned on by the farm admin. I don't have any steps in here to do it. It's pretty easy to search for. And it gives you a nice little overview from a dashboard standpoint to see what's going on, kind of similar to the ULS log view. Use Fiddler. If you don't use Fiddler, you should start using Fiddler. Fiddler's fantastic, and will give you a lot of great feedback on what's going on from the client side. And IE F12 dev tools are really, really good, especially in IE 11. I encourage you to use them. There's a link here to kind of walk through they have called the F12 Adventure, and it gives you a quick overview on how to use those tools, but they're very, very helpful. So, most developers working in SharePoint in production environments is really a mystery, and that's where these tips are coming in. So the ULS logs, it's kind of, if you've ever been hit in the head from behind and turned around and see nothing, that's kind of what it feels like to work in a SharePoint production environment and try to figure out why something's broken. When something goes wrong within that site, it's really tough to track it down, and SharePoint doesn't really help. So using these tools can help you fix those problems. And most developers overlook what they can do themselves, and that's writing to that SharePoint log. And it's better than the system event log, as I mentioned earlier. And in a production environment, it's likely you'll only have logs to be able to track down problems. And Fiddler is where that tool comes in from the client side, and you can monitor your page requests, and it's going to report any errors during the interaction of those requests, and that's extremely helpful for things like missing images or scripts, and etc. So that pretty much concludes my tips section. I think we've got about 3 minutes left here. There's some contact information if you guys would like to ping me about any specific questions. I'd be happy to answer them, or there's a LinkedIn thing there too. Apps are really a game changer for SharePoint. The concept is going to attract developers to the platform and open up a lot of possibilities, in my opinion. And being able to use current web programming skills and common web standards like HTML and JavaScript is certainly a really good reason to look at writing apps over traditional SharePoint solutions whenever possible. So listen, we've got one question on configuring the farms that for just on-prem. So yeah, so O365, the store is turned on by default. One thing that's you can do is control the public store. So those steps are really just for the on-prem that are turned off in that piece for SharePoint on-prem. So I'll leave it open here for a couple more minutes with questions. Thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you guys got a little more out of this than you came into it about SharePoint app development. Thanks again.